First of all, I'm going to tell you about this picture, because I think this is one. There's a couple of variations of this picture that I found. I actually don't know its name, but I think it's one of the most amazing images I've ever come across, because in some ways it sums up Christianity in one picture, and that's no easy thing to do. And the reason I think it's important to talk about this Christian representation, for example, though we've already talked about some Taoist representations, is because insofar as we're embedded in westernized civilization, the roots of westernized civilization they push themselves down into Christianity, and then there's deeper substrata under that, the religious structures that preceded Christianity. But if you want to understand the Western notions of the person and the ideal person as well, you have to look at the structure of the systems that Western civilization grew out of, because the religious systems, for example, are the systems in which the idea of the ideal emerged. And so you can't come to grips with the idea of the ideal, or the idea of mental health, which is an ideal, without understanding the ground out of which these ideas emerged. You can't come to terms with it in any fundamental sense. And the thing is, if you're doing clinical psychology, for example, you have to come to terms with it in a fundamental sense, because a lot of the time when people come and see you, the reason they come and see you is because their sense of life's meaning has been shattered, and they're unable to proceed without the restoration of that meaning. So maybe their belief systems fell apart, and they face some sort of tragedy that's just blown them into pieces, and they have no idea how to orient themselves. Because life always presents an existential question, and one that we'll deal with later, which is life is difficult, and it's characterized by suffering. And because of that, there has to be a reason to stand up against that. And so the reason has to be made coherent. So you have to know, in some sense, that you're the sort of creature that can voluntarily face the tragic conditions of existence and prevail. And that's a religious presupposition, fundamentally, because it's based on, it's a hypothesis in some sense, that human beings are like that. So let me tell you about this image, because it's a staggering image. It's so brilliant. So the first thing you'll notice is that, of course, there's a tree in the middle of it, and it sort of looks like the tree that, a little kid would draw. They sort of look like lollipops or something like that. So it's a schematized tree. And you'll see, of course, that the snake is wrapped around the tree. The snake and the tree seem to come along together unbelievably often. So Asclepius's rod, for example. Asclepius is the Greek god of healing. And you see the symbol of the Greek god of healing, which is Asclepius's rod, is still used to represent physicians. And it's a rod with a snake wrapped around it too. And the snake represents transformation, because it can die and it can shed its skin and sort of be reborn. And for many other reasons besides. But in this representation, which is partly derived from Genesis and then partly derived from the development of Christian ideas for thousands of years after that, there's a particular idea that's being portrayed. Now, you notice that up in the tree, there are little things that look like fruit, and one of those things is a skull, right? Now, so the idea there is that the fruit that the tree produced is in some manner equivalent to death. Now, in the Genesis story, what happens is that Eve tempts Adam with the fruit from the tree. So she offers him this fruit. Now, that's a very interesting thing, because women, historically speaking, have been gatherers. Like men do the hunting, generally speaking, in archaic societies, and women do the gathering. And human beings have also subsisted for large parts of their evolutionary history, before we were human beings, as frugivores. We ate fruit. And the reason we have color vision, by the way, is so that we can detect ripe fruit. And ripe fruit is also tightly associated with sexuality. So like if you look through the ads in women's magazines, the makeup ads, the associations between ripeness and fruit and, say, women's cheeks and women's lips are always they're much put forward. And so there's a tight association between sexuality and food, and for a variety of reasons. So Eve basically tempts Adam, in some sense, into a conscious relationship with her by offering him food. And in the case of the Genesis story, it's ripe fruit. And so it's an enticement. And she also entices him into self-consciousness, which is quite interesting, because number one, women do make men self-conscious. I mean, that's sort of an ultimate truth of the nature of the relationship between men and women. And rejection in particular is something that makes men self-conscious, and they're much more exposed to that than women are in the sort of sexual dance, because women are sort of, on average, quite successful at seeking out sexual encounters where men are, on average, very unsuccessful at doing the same thing. So they suffer a lot of rejection. It's a very fundamental form of rejection, right? It's like, well, you're good enough to maybe tolerate being alive and all that, but your genetic material should by no means be allowed to, move itself into the future. It's a really fundamental form of rejection, and the rejection is, well, you don't measure up, and that's certainly the ground of self-consciousness. And so there's a lot of weird things tangled up together in the Genesis story. So Eve gives Adam the fruit, and what happens is that wakes him up. What the story says is that the scales fall from his eyes, and then the first thing that happens is he realizes he's naked. And that's a very interesting kind of realization, because one of the very common nightmares that people have is that they're naked in front of a crowd. So you might say, well, what does it mean to be naked in front of a crowd? Well, it means to have your vulnerability exposed to the arbitrary judgment of the cultural mass. It's a nightmare for most people. And human beings are very weird animals, because most animals wander around on four legs, and of course, that means the armored part of their body is what shows, right? Their spine and their ribs along the back, which is pretty tough and hard. But human beings are standing up. So the most vulnerable parts of our body are broadcast straight forward. So when human beings woke up during our evolutionary, progress towards the kind of consciousness we have, when we became self-conscious, that was essentially equivalent to recognizing our naked vulnerability. And that's what the Genesis story is trying to relate. And it also points out that it says snakes, women, and fruit played an integral role in the development of human self-consciousness. And so here, the fruit that's being eaten is equivalent to death, and that's why there's a skull in the tree. And so, because what happened was when people became self-conscious, like consciously self-conscious, we started to understand the full nature of our vulnerability. And so what does that mean? Well, for human beings, in part, it meant that we discovered time. And that's a great thing to discover, because then it means you have the future to think about. But it's also an absolute bloody catastrophe, because you also understand that the future is finite, and that your life is bounded, and that you will end. And as far as we know, human beings are the only creatures that have to contend with that knowledge. And once you have it, once you wake up like that, there's no going back to sleep. It's a qualitative transformation in the nature of experience. And, the Genesis story pushes the idea farther. It says the fact that we've woken up and are aware of our vulnerability is also what makes us fallen creatures. It makes us alienated from existence in a way that animals aren't. And so what that also means, and this is sort of an existential idea, is that the rise of self-consciousness in that manner, which is in part the knowledge of death, is also what's made people, well, one of the things that happens, for example, in Genesis is, it's quite a funny story. So Eve makes Adam all self-conscious, and then they wander off and cover themselves up, right, which is sort of the first entry of cultural artifacts into the paradisal state. It's right. The first thing you do once you realize you're naked is cover yourself up. Now, that story is often interpreted in a sexual way, and there's elements of that, but it's more pragmatic. It's like, yeah, once you figure out that you're naked and that you're going to freeze to death and that it's cold in the future, it's like the first thing you do is cover yourself up. And people have been wearing clothes for a very long time. We've been wearing clothes for so long that body lice are adapted to clothing. And so it's been tens of thousands of years. So, and obviously human beings are also the only creatures that wear clothes, which is, and it's a human universal, by the way. People wear clothes everywhere, virtually everywhere that human beings have been discovered. So you cover yourself up, and that's the first indication that you're aware of your vulnerability. But you're also aware of the necessity of taking care of yourself as a separate entity, which animals don't really seem to have that notion. I mean, they get hungry and all that. But it's not obvious that they can extend the idea of hunger into the future, so that so that they're caring about times that are not here yet.